Hi, smart moms and dads. Welcome to another episode of the Brainy Moms Podcast, brought to you today by Learning RX Brain Training Centers. I'm Dr. Amy Moore here with my co host, Sandy Zamalis. And before we welcome our guest, I just want to remind you guys that if you want more from us, you can sign up for our free monthly newsletter. It's just full of additional resources, recaps from our episodes for the month, and just a deeper dive into the topics that we cover here on the show. And now, our conversation today is with Martin Cothran. Let me tell you a little bit about him in case you don't know who he is yet. Martin is the co-founder of Highlands Latin School in Louisville, Kentucky, and co-founder of Memoria Press, the largest provider of classical Christian materials for home, private, and charter schools. He's the editor of Classical Teacher magazine and has been involved in the classical education movement since the late 1990s as a writer, speaker, and curriculum developer. He's authored several high school textbooks on logic and reasoning called Traditional Logic 1 and 2 and Material Logic. He currently serves as provost of Memoria College, which offers a Master of Arts degree in the Great Books. And he's the co-host of the podcast Classical, Etc. He's here with us today to talk about logic, critical thinking, and some other fun ideas related to classical education. Welcome, Martin.
Good to be here.
We're so glad you're here. Let's kick us off with just a quick kind of overview of how you got into classical education, and maybe even share what classical education is for new homeschool families or for people even thinking about homeschooling who've never heard of classical education.
Yes, well, I got involved in education when I was a public policy analyst, and our state passed what was at that time the biggest education reform that had ever been attempted by a state. And we started looking at it, and at that time I didn't really know a lot about the history of education, but it didn't take too long to discover that it was a really extreme form of progressivism. And so and this we discovered later happens every 25 years, almost, you can almost clock it, where we come in with these very permissivist kinds of programs, and we have to have, put kids of different ages and ability levels in the same room, and the one in these uh, in part was part of the program, back away from basic skills, a lot of those things that we remember from the 20s, the late 40s, happened again in the late 60s, then in the late 80s, and then somewhat with Common Core. So we began to fight that, and I was a lobbyist at the time. We actually won the fight, interestingly enough, but the education establishment always comes back to this place. And so you can fight it, but it's a little bit like the Blob in the old movie. You all the energy you use against it, it takes within itself and makes itself more powerful. And so I met Cheryl Lowe when I was doing that, and she really understood education really well. And so she said, "Oh, you need to read this. You need to read this. You need to read this." And this was, by the way, back in the uh, mid '80s. And so I started studying. My background's in philosophy, and economics is my academic background. And so we, and she was talking about classical education, which I had never heard of before. Turns out it was what we used to do in schools, basically. It's what we used to call education. And so we decided we wanted to found a publishing company and a school because there was no material out for classical schools at that point in time. And so we came out with 3 programs. She had a Latin program that was already selling sort of word of mouth in the thousands. And so we published her book. She wanted a logic program and a rhetoric program to just establish the basic language skills that are involved in classical education. And so we put together a catalog, sent it out, and it was immediately successful. And there was, at that time, it was really just starting, but there was a growing number of classical schools out there. And we ended up founding the school, Highlands Latin School, here in Louisville, Kentucky. The publishing company has just continued to grow. And I don't know what else to say there. So here we are. And so I think and as we have grown, the movement has grown. I think that this is the hottest thing on the education charts right now. And, every private school I see opening up is a classical school. So I think it's going to continue to grow. And so what I have done over the last several decades is just articulate and re-articulate what classical education is, because it is, like you say, Amy, it's a foreign term to people, and so we do need to define it. So I've been doing that in our magazine, The Classical Teacher, where we have over 100,000 readers for that magazine. It's quarterly, and just doing that, just articulating and re-articulating what it is in one form or another.
So, talk to us a little bit about um, the stages of classical education and how it differs from elementary to middle to high school.
Okay. I think there's a little bit of a misperception, okay, because the movement got started because of an essay by Dorothy Sayers, where she talked about these 3 stages of learning, which she used the labels grammar, logic, and rhetoric. And she, I don't think she was actually articulating what classical education was. In fact, she never says it in there. Um, but it was a taxonomy of learning. Um, and it makes perfect sense that she would basically, what she's saying is focus on the basic, um, particularly language things in the grammar stage, which is the lower level of schooling, primary school, we'd probably call it. And when you get to late elementary school anyway, you now are expressing much more of what you are as a human being, which is a reasoning animal. Um, and so you study logic, and then later on, she talked about rhetoric, which she sort of characterized as the poetic stage, a creative kind of stage. Now she wasn't. She knew the literal meaning of those words in the old program, but she was using that as sort of a metaphor for this taxonomy that she had. And so that's what actually started the movement. But I think the movement has kind of grown to realize that although that taxonomy is a good taxonomy, it actually, I think, reflects a reality that the old classical education was something different from that, because taxonomies only come about after psychology in the late 19th century. We start getting, because we're focused on now and how children learn. That's the almost sole focus of modern pedagogy, is how a child learns, many times, unfortunately, at the expense of content knowledge and other things. If you went back to the old classical education, there were no taxonomies because people weren't thinking that way. They weren't thinking about how children learned. They were thinking about what they needed to know, and their pedagogy was centered on the nature of the subject. The nature of the subject dictated the, how something was taught. And then, of course, you had to deal with all those regular things about, how the age of the child obviously matters and how you teach them and all that. So really, hers was not really a classical idea. It was a modern idea, but she used the classical trivium as a metaphor for her idea, which again I think is fine. Sayers' taxonomy is I think a valid one. But even she, if you ask Dorothy Sayers what classical education was, she would say what we would say, because that's the way she was educated. She was educated in the old classical system in England.
Interesting. So, do you think that article kind of took off and has adulterated the understanding of it? Kind of like how we have American Montessori that isn't actually the same spirit of the original
Mhm.
Montessori. It kind of has morphed into a a version of it.
Mhm.
So let me just preface this, by
Mhm.
saying that, um, you know, I was trained in the core knowledge, what your first grader needs to know, what your second grader needs to know, right? And so this language is not as familiar to me as it is to Sandy, who
Mm.
was immersed in classical education. So
Mhm.
I'm actually going to let her kind of transition this part of the conversation.
I think, to your point, Martin, it's interesting. I think for our listeners, for you to really kind of get maybe down into the true definition of what a classical education is, because it has sort of morphed over the years between, Susan Wise Bauer's Well-Trained Mind and classical conversations. And there's been lots of iterations of what a
Mhm.
classical education is.
And I
And
know all
so
those people. They're all friends, but
yes, and it's all
we
great
do have
stuff.
disagreements.
Yeah, it's all great stuff, but you guys definitely do come because I love all the curriculums. We did some classical homeschooling when my kids were older, not when they were younger, but when they were
Mhm.
older. And I think what's really intimidating about a classical model is how much the adult that is the teacher or the instructor doesn't know or understand about the classical model and the classical,
Mhm.
trajectory of, what you're aiming for. So let's go there. Let's get into a deep definition. What is classical education from your perspective? What should a parent be thinking about or focusing on to get that true classical experience?
Yes. Well, I think if you actually go back and you want to define what the old classical education actually was, which I think is still the valid definition. Obviously, there are things about the modern world that will, qualify it in some way. But um, let me give you kind of two definitions, one a very practical definition and then one a more philosophical definition. Okay. The practical definition is it's the liberal arts and the great books. The liberal arts were a set of intellectual skills. We talk a lot about skills now. That was the old way of looking at skills. It was the liberal arts. And there were three linguistic arts, grammar, logic, and rhetoric. And there were four mathematical arts, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. So there were your language and math skills. And then there was the great books, the great ideas, the best that's been thought and said. So that's a real practical definition. On a more philosophical level, what it is teaching young people how to be human beings. Okay, and there was an ideal of what human nature was, and the fact that we have, an intellect, a will, and an imagination, and taking those things into account in terms of what we taught them. But the overarching, the Aristotle has his four causes, which is basically a definitional scheme, and the most important one was final cause. What is the purpose of a thing? So, what's the purpose of classical education? The purpose of classical education is, again, to develop human beings and to pass on our civilization, right? We've acquired, through the history of Western civilization, we've acquired all of these things, all this knowledge, um, and we don't need to start anew every time we start with it. This is stuff that's been handed down to us. Other people have discovered it, have refined it, have refined how to teach it, and so the purpose of classical education is to pass that on to another generation. So there's that individual goal, the development of a human being, of a human soul, and then the cultural goal, which is to pass on a civilization.
I love that, especially from the communication side of that equation. I feel like so much of our educational options and choices, other than the classical model, honestly, skip out on the truly linguistic side, like you kind of shared
Mhm.
a little bit ago, of how to communicate well and effectively, and to truly understand language. Like I feel those pieces sort of slipping away
Mhm.
when I look at modern curriculum today.
Right. We're very focused um, on science and mathematics. And I say that as someone whose sons are, principal software developers for major companies, but they never took a computer course. They were classically educated. They knew how to think. And once you know how to do that, you can do anything. And you never know what you're going to
Right.
have to do, to get a job later on. So that's why we always, because classical education is a general education too. It's not specialized. Um, and so I do think language is very important. That I do think that classical education has this emphasis on language arts that you don't find in a lot of other places. And it is a very organized approach to language study. You're studying grammar. This is the structure not only of what we write and read, but of how we think. That is a fundamental aspect of human thinking. Um, and logic is, reasoning. We are reasoning animals, and we have disagreements, and we have to arbitrate those. And if you want to do it without getting mad at somebody, become then learn logic and become better at doing it. Because a lot of people get mad because they're insecure because they can't argue well, and that's important these days. It seems like, right, with all the stuff going on. And then rhetoric, the art of persuasion. And Aristotle writes about this. He talks about ethos, logos, and pathos, which are, Aristotle knew what the human soul was. And that is reflective of that ethos, logos, pathos breakdown is very reflective of that. If you want to persuade somebody, you have to appeal to all parts of their soul, their intellect, their will, and their imagination. You have that allows you to reach every part of the human being who you are arguing with to persuade him of your position.
So talk a little bit about how we teach that. How do we develop that in kids?
Well, let me start with something, and a lot of people don't understand this, but I can't stress the importance of it enough, and that is Latin. Okay, because if you want to learn grammar, it's very hard to do in English, particularly because English is so uh, um, free and easy about the grammar. But so you need another language. Number one, you need another language to study grammar in, whatever that is, right? But then you need a structured language, one that does have all the grammatical inflections in it. Our words do not change whether they're the subject or the direct object or it's the same spelling, it's the same everything. Which is why we do sentence diagrams. I don't know how many sentence diagrams I had, but because they're trying to get you to understand the grammatical inflections, and it's hard to do in English because they're all spelled the same. In Latin, if it's the subject, it's got a nominative ending on the end. If it's a direct object, it's got a direct object. It's got the accusative ending on the end. The word tells you what its role in the sentence is, which is why word order doesn't matter all that much in Latin. And this is completely alien to us. But what it does is it forces us to learn noun cases, which we simply do not see in English. And it's very hard to learn. And so I think that you need a foreign language. You need one that's grammatically inflected and one that is regular, where there's not all these changes, that don't have to do with the grammar, all these irregularities. Latin is the language, and in addition to that, it's got the vocabulary for about half of our language. You see, if you don't know Latin, you'll see it happens to me every day. I'll see a word that I didn't realize had a Latin root, and I go, oh yeah, I know that Latin, and it gives me an insight into the meaning of that word because I know the Latin word. So there's just a lot of advantages to it, but that is how we advocate teaching that fundamental discipline of grammar is with a foreign language. Start with Latin. We later on at our school go on to New Testament Greek, but Greek is a harder language and it does have some more irregularities than Latin does. So And Latin was always used that way. It's part of our heritage of learning Latin. You go back 100 years, and people knew if you were an educated person, really educated person, if you knew Latin.
I'm going to be devil's advocate just because there may be some listeners here who are thinking, why do I care about dead languages? Because we hear that argument all the time. How could you kind of fundamentally help a parent understand why what you're saying is beneficial for the growth of their child and their trajectory and understanding language?
Well, I mean, some of the things I just said, but number one of the things grammar does is it imposes an order on our thought. And that's one of the indirect results of it, is that it's a hard study, but there's rules, and the rules almost always apply. You can count on them. And to have a subject like that, there's very few subjects like that where it's got these rules. Math does that, but if we said, well, why do you need to study grammar with Latin? Well, for the same reason you need to do arithmetic, and you need to do all those mathematical things, which, I mean, I don't use a lot of now, but I did I got up to calculus anyway. And those are essential for the sciences. In the same way, I think a knowledge of language is really essential, really more so than math is, because we're not all scientists and we're not all mathematicians, we're not all this, but we all use language and we use it every day. And so if you don't have Latin to do this for you, to arrange your brain in accordance with the grammar of language, there is a central grammar and it's best expressed in Latin, then I don't know what else you do. I mean, language is the most important thing, more important than math, I would say, because we all use it no matter what. So what's the subject you're going to use to study that? I just don't know a better one than Latin.
And it's such a great connector, I think, over history, too. That's the piece I think that sometimes parents miss. Neil Postman wrote a book, and the name I can't think of at the moment, but one of those pieces was, when you lose grammar, when you lose that ability to understand what's being said, you lose historical documents because you don't understand more complex sentence structure to be able to really get to the meat of what is this person trying to say, especially in older time when there was definitely more, verbose language and you're really having to pull things apart. And there was more classical education then. So there's, bigger vocabulary, longer sentence structures, really trying to figure out, what is the topic of this sentence? What is this sentence about? Just read the preamble to, like the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution, and you're, have to sit there for a minute and try to make sure you understand all the pieces of that statement.
Right. And if you know Latin, one of the things you do, if you see a word you don't know, you immediately ask, is it Latin roots? And you can read it. And frequently I'll see a word I have not seen before, but I know what it means because I know Latin.
Homeschool OT is for families whose children want to learn and participate, but struggle with what their days require. Things like starting work, staying regulated, writing, reading, or following through on plans. Created by occupational therapist and homeschool mom Sarah Collins, Homeschool OT helps parents understand why these challenges show up by breaking down executive functioning, sensory processing, and motor skills in real, practical ways. Through the OT is In podcast, parent coaching, and targeted classes, families learn how to turn that understanding into strategies they can actually use in their homeschool day. Because homeschooling is not alone schooling. You can find support, resources, and expert guidance at homeschoolot.com. And now, a word from our sponsor, LearningRx. In middle school, Kevin had given up on learning because of his reading struggles. His parents had tried everything, and they were losing hope until they enrolled him in the cognitive training and reading programs at LearningRx. It was hard, but he gained confidence as he strengthened his memory, attention, processing speed, visualization, reasoning, and auditory processing skills. Years later, his mother wrote to us that Kevin has graduated from college and is beginning his master's degree. He's a military officer and is married with his own children. He's thriving in life, in learning, and in his career. We can't promise your child will have the same results as Kevin, but we'd love to talk to you about our brain training programs. If your child is struggling with reading or learning, talk to the team at LearningRx to see if we might be the right fit for your child. Visit learningrx.com/thebrainymoms to learn more and receive a cognitive skills assessment with a consultation for just $99. That's learningrx.com/thebrainymoms.
So I want to go back to something that you said a second ago about your sons and having a liberal arts education, but working in a tech field. And that's the beauty of having a classical education, is that you can apply that no matter what field. And so I can remember several years ago, my nephew was considering, like a $60,000 a year liberal arts degree. And I
Mhm.
was really struggling to wrap my brain around the value of that.
Mhm.
Um, so talk a little bit about that applicability to all things, like why critical thinking and logic and this philosophy of education is applicable to all
Mhm.
subjects later.
Right. Well, and I'll just say to start out with there that if you're talking about a $60,000 liberal arts program, number one, $60,000 is probably too much for any program, and number two, what does liberal arts mean there at that particular school? Because that's a very equivocal term, right?
Sure.
Um, yeah. So I asked my oldest son. I mean, he's like he's the principal software person for a top 40 company and a telecommunications company, and he has a background in philosophy mostly. That's his interest. That's his hobby actually, and he's a published academic writer in that world. So he's just real smart. So maybe he could have just done anything because of who he is. I don't know. But I asked one time. I said, "So when you were studying programming, because he just learned on his own, and when you were studying programming, um, did your college classes in modern logic help you? Because we focus on traditional logic at the school, but modern logic is much more mathematical and it's a more recent historical invention." But it always looked to me like computer programming, this is symbolic logic, right? Just like programming is. And he said, well, it that helped me all right, but what helped me even more was studying Latin. Because he said what people don't realize is programming is not just math. It is a language and it has a grammar, right? Um, and so really just understanding grammar helped me to understand advanced programming. He's like an expert on closure. He writes journal articles on it and all that stuff, which is apparently a very advanced language. And there's much more grammar in there. So it's not just a mathematical equation like the basic programming that they teach you in school is. So I think one of the important things, and I think what he would say, is that the even the programming world is changing all the time. And this is most professions are this way. If you try to learn what is going on today and you focus just on that, then when you get there, you will be obsolete. Okay. Whereas if you have this fundamental intellectual understanding of things that come about from the study of things like grammar, you're going to be able to understand any instantiation of grammar, whatever it is, whatever computer language it is, you're going to be able to learn that fairly quickly because you understand the basic fundamentals of that. And I think that's really something that's wrong with our schools is that we have, um, I remember when I was in University of California and I took some computer classes, it was Pascal and Fortran. Well, those languages were obsolete by the time I graduated, right? And the university programs are famous for this. They're behind the times. They're not doing that actual work. They've been out of it for a while. And Mark Zuckerberg said that, Mark Zuckerberg, who knew how to read and write Latin and Greek and could read Hebrew before he went to college. People don't realize that a lot of those guys are classically educated. And in addition to that, a lot of them send their kids to low-tech or classical schools because they don't want them, doing screens and all that stuff all the time. It's an interesting irony. But I think that Mark Zuckerberg said, look, the computer industry is changing every 5 minutes. It's constantly changed. So you have to have a base that you can apply to a whole bunch of different kinds of things. And in fact, there was a great book that came out probably about 5 years ago now, called Range: How Generalists Thrive in a Specialized World. David Epstein wrote it, and he talks in there about this and about this fact that a broad education is going to better outfit you for the workforce, and that the STEM people don't seem to realize this, that this broad education actually is a better education than a specialized education is. Because you've got these fundamental skills that you can apply to anything as it changes and changes and changes.
So in thinking, because I'm going back to what you said at the very beginning when you talked about like every 25 years, that progressive kind of agenda comes in, and there's always this underbelly of people wanting to go back to that classical education. Let's talk a little bit more about that. I think misalignment with, for example, like Common Core or some of the educational pieces that come in and really try to dictate, what does our country want to be successful in? What jobs do we see that we want to provide, a solid workforce for? How, as homeschooling families, because there's a fear that happens from a homeschooling mom's perspective. Like you get into high school and all of a sudden you start panicking that you haven't covered everything, that you've missed something. We actually, like I said, got into classical education at that point because I felt like I was missing something, and I wanted to make sure that we were trying to hit some of those deeper things and prepare the kids for a future that was coming. But it's really hard to battle that, I think, societal or cultural push to figure out, like Amy was saying, like, yeah, what are you going to go to college for? What are you going to be when you grow up? Do you have your lane picked out? And you're thinking that way. And then, then we hear about like what you're saying, like, okay, yeah, but we want to make them great thinkers, and trying to like balance those two pieces of the equation is really hard from a homeschooling perspective. So what kind of guidance do you give parents or, share with people of how to juggle that out? Because we can trust, like you said, that, things will work out. We're creating great thinkers and they're going to have, a great trajectory. But we also, have that fear. We don't want, especially homeschooling parents, we don't want to mess this up, right? We don't want to like have our kids be frustrated with us that we didn't prepare them for the future. So
yes, homeschooling mother insecurity is
yes,
a
all
recurring
of them.
theme. Because we were homeschoolers, and my wife was the same way. She's so am I doing all the things I need to do to prepare my student for the workforce, for life in general? And I think that I think a lot of people, if you had somebody from one of the local public schools come to our school and they looked at what we were doing, they would say, well, why aren't you doing technology? Why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you doing that? And the reason we're not doing those things is because we're doing the things that that will allow them to do any of those things. And so I just think I'll return to that again, to that theme of general education, because you don't know what the modern workforce is going to look like. Yeah, I think what you were asking, Sandy, was you mentioned that 25-year cycle.
Yes, because there's a huge cultural push, right, to think about preparing for jobs for the future. And then there's also, what you're saying, this really deep, I mean, I do think it's like our for those of us that are drawn to like the classical model, there's definitely an understanding that we're missing some great understanding of history, of language, by missing out on the classical piece. So how do we help a parent balance that kind of dichotomy between sticking with sort of a classical model and why that's so important, and then also trying to think about how to prepare or battle the culture that says we should be preparing our children for whatever jobs are available out there?
Right. And I think that, I've already talked about Latin and how it's sort of a skeleton key when it comes to the language side of things. I mean, one of the things that is the problem in our schools is the proliferation of subjects. And that's why we don't have that many subjects. We have language arts and we have math, and then we read good books at the very young level and great books later on. I said before, we're human beings. We have an intellect, we have a will, and we have an imagination. And one of the things that you'll find at our school that you don't find at a lot of other schools is reading of books. This is hugely important. And those aren't things you can, quantify in the way that you can quantify math and science and all that. But, we are trying to educate our kids to be intelligent. And we are trying to we're trying to educate our kids in order to be good. And how do you do that? I mean, one of the things we haven't talked about is moral instruction. You do that by reading stories. The best book on this subject is Why Johnny Can't Tell Right and Wrong by William Kilpatrick. And he makes this point that these modern values clarification programs and this sort of thing, they try to give you these moral dilemmas and you're supposed to figure them out with no rules. And what you find in the old way of doing that was you read books where there was good versus evil, and the good character was very evident to you. You didn't have to be told. It was very evident to you. And so you learned how to be good, not by learning some lessons in goodness. You learned to be good because you were exposed to good people, and they were clearly delineated for you in the literature of our civilization. And so you just simply imitated them. You knew what goodness was by just looking at it. And he contrasts, this a lifeboat with 5 people on it, and there's only food for 4. Who do you throw overboard? There's dilemmas that don't have solutions, right? And he compares it to the movie A Night to Remember, which was the old black and white movie on the sinking of the Titanic, where you had a man dressed up as a woman trying to sneak on the lifeboat on one hand, and you had the captain and the crew who go down with the ship singing hymns. And what that does psychologically, I think, for the reader is it gives you the example of what you don't want to be. It's unattractive to you naturally. And then you look at the other, the captain and the crew, and you say to yourself implicitly, if I'm ever in that situation, that's what I'm going to do. And so that's what literature does for you. That it's attacking problems from another part of the soul, the imagination. It's undergirding the things that you are learning intellectually. You may study ethics at some point, but the books that you read, the stories, narrative that you read is really what's going to make a difference, because what narrative does, it's the context where there's meaning. You can't talk about morality really outside some kind of narrative context, because you're answering questions like, okay, so there's certain things you do with one person that you don't do with another person. There's things where the context matters. There's things, all kinds of things that only a narrative can give you. And so literature is very important. I mean, that's just one of the reasons why literature is very important. And there's also just the sheer knowledge of how people interact with each other, and history. We stress a lot of narrative history, a history that is a story, and learning. Again, that undergirds the whole moral thing, but also gives you information on the things that happen and makes you familiar with them and allows you not just to know them, but to see them. Right. So I could make other points, but I'll leave it there.
Yeah, I was reading an article you wrote, and I wrote this quote down because I was so moved by it. You say, "It is a thing not best taught through admonition or explanation. It is best taught by inspiration." And you were talking about that this idea of virtue and education and learning what it means to do the right thing, can't really exist outside the context of Christianity, right? Like that's where we get that's where we get what is right. But the idea that you could pull people in with the stories, with characters who are role models because they were moral and they did the right thing. And that is something that children especially can attach themselves to. They can see themselves in those characters.
Yes, sympathy and empathy. Those are only developed in that kind of a context. A story where you can see the characters and you know the story and you know the past and you know the prospective future, and yeah, I think that's really important, and that gets to I mentioned Aristotle, ethos, logos, and pathos. This is the pathos end of things. You're reaching the heart, not just the head.
Love it.
So much good stuff to think about on that end, just because, I mean, to your point, in modern education, sometimes libraries are full of books, right? So it's not just about reading, to your point, it's about picking and choosing and reading for a bigger purpose, and also to think through history. So that you can grapple with some of those historical contexts, like you said, the historical narratives, but also maybe even some deeper, pieces that you wouldn't even consider. Like, I think someone posted something recently about, and I had never thought of it this way, that Lord of the Rings was really about thinking through all of the moral failings of humanity and all of the different characters. And I just thought, oh my gosh, that is such an interesting way to think about that. And that's really true. Like, was Gollum bad at the beginning, or was it because he was greedy and the greed took over? Right. So like really getting into some deep conversation about why people choose to do, things they shouldn't, like, whether
I always talk about, when you think of the Wicked Witch of the West, she wasn't born evil, right? She was born green, and you're born green. So you're bullied and you become a product of what has happened to you. And the same with like the Lord of the Rings. And so, obviously, like he turned into this. And so it is interesting to kind of look at, well, what happens to people to make them make poor choices, bad choices, evil choices, right? And then where could we have inserted ourselves in that journey, in that story, maybe to change the trajectory of where they've ended up? And I think that's a great lesson for kids to think about too, right? Like how can I be important in someone's life so that I change the trajectory of their moral development?
Right, and they see examples in literature of how that's possible. They see a character who may feel like them, and they see how they have gotten out of that, and so it's not just telling them in rationalistic terms what to do. It's showing them, look, this person was like you are, and yet they became this. How did they do that? I sometimes want to call literature "How to Be a Human Being." I mean, that's because that's really what it is.
Is that how you would define a great book?
Yeah, sort of. And there's great books they bring different things to the table for you, and you never know what they're going to be, and you don't read them for that reason, but they just do that. I mean, I finished Jane Eyre, I guess it was about 3 years ago, and I was driving home, so I had a lot of time to think. I was at a conference in St. Louis. I'm driving back to Louisville, and, and I just thought, what happens in there, you could never explain. You could only show it. That's the only way that she could have communicated that point, is the way she did. And I also just thought, what a civilization we must have that could produce a book like that from some woman, uneducated, formerly living out in the country in England. What, what kind of civilization does it take to produce something? That's how great our civilization is. It produced Jane Eyre. It produced Pride and Prejudice. It produced Tale of Two Cities. You know, that's the legacy of our civilization. And we just need to soak and steep our kids in those kinds of books so that they'll realize that at some point later in their life, I'm sure.
So, for parents who are considering um, adopting the classical education method for homeschooling, or they're choosing a charter school or a classical academy,
Mhm.
what resources would you point them to give them a start in as they consider this?
Well, I think that, in terms of what they can do, we have our magazine. A lot of those and a lot of the articles from 20 years of our magazine are up online, and so they can just go on that search bar and search whatever topic they're trying to think of at memoriapress.com, and that's one way to do it. And then, we have a number of resources they can read so that they can kind of just know what it is. I mean, and again, our magazine is doing that all the time. Every issue is some other angle on what classical education is, and it's free. Okay, so uh, I think that's one thing to do. There's a really good book that we published called Simply Classical by Cheryl Swope, and that was written for special needs students. But when we finished the book and got it all published and everything, we realized, we looked at each other and said, this is just a great book on classical education, regardless of what it was intended for. It's just a great introduction to classical education. I'll be coming out with a book. We're working on it right now. It's a collection of my essays over 20 years on classical education and other topics. But our website has a lot of resources on it.
Well, I'm excited to read that book. Like I said at the top of the hour, you're such an engaging writer that I've enjoyed reading
Oh, thank
your
you.
blog posts and your Substack posts, and so uh, that'll be a
Well,
great
again, I
resource
just
for.
explained to Sandy, we just started the Substack, so more coming.
Nice. I'm excited. All right. Is there anything that you want to say to our listeners that you haven't gotten to say today?
I don't think so. I always feel like I've said more than what I should have said, and then an hour later, I'll think of 5 things I should have said. So,
Absolutely. Well, you'll just have to email us and say, hey, I want to come back and say 5 more things. How's that?
all right.
Martin Cothran, thank you so much for being with us
Thank
today,
you.
for taking time out of your schedule to share your insights and wisdom and experience. We really appreciate it, and I know our listeners will too.
Well, thank you for having me on.
All right, listeners, thank you for spending this hour with us. We love it. We know that you're busy and you could choose to spend this hour in lots of different ways. And so we hope you feel a little bit smarter after spending it with us. Hey, remember, if you want more from us, sign up for our free newsletter at thebrainymoms.com. You can find us on social media at The Brainy Moms. You can find Sandy on TikTok at The Brain Trainer Lady. Look, that's all we have for you today, so we're going to catch you next time.